It is about the size of a pint glass, and it screws onto the nose of an artillery shell. Inside it, there is a radio transmitter. There is a receiver. There is an amplifier, an electrical detonator, a safety mechanism, and a battery. All of it packed into a plastic cone you could hold in one hand. That radio has to work while being fired out of a naval gun, which means it has to survive an acceleration of around 20,000 times the force of gravity in the space of a few thousandths of a second. And then it has to keep working while spinning at roughly 500 revolutions every second. In 1940, the only way to amplify a radio signal was a vacuum tube. A vacuum tube is a glass bulb with fine wire filaments suspended inside it. It was designed to sit still on a shelf in a wooden cabinet in somebody's living room. Every engineer who was asked about this said the same thing. The tubes will shatter, not might, will. They were wrong about it. Around 22 million of these were built. The program cost something in the region of $1 billion, at a time when the entire atomic bomb project cost about $2 billion. More than 100 companies were involved, and almost none of them were told what they were making. And in the last week of August 1944, batteries of guns firing shells fitted with this device destroyed the overwhelming majority of the German flying bombs that came at them. Not a fraction, most of them. But for nearly 2 years before that, the men who had it were forbidden to fire it over land, under any circumstances. And the reason had nothing whatsoever to do with how well it worked. This is the story of the proximity fuse. But to understand why anyone attempted something this absurd, you have to understand how badly the alternative was failing. Shooting at an aeroplane with a gun is much harder than it looks. The shell takes time to get there. A target at 15,000 feet might be 20 seconds of flight away. In 20 seconds, an aircraft traveling at 300 miles an hour has moved almost 2 miles. So you do not aim at the aircraft. You aim at where you calculate it is going to be, and you hope it does not turn. That is only the first problem. The second is the fuse. An anti-aircraft shell is not going to hit the aeroplane. The odds against a direct hit at that range are enormous. What it has to do instead is explode close enough that the fragments do the work, and to do that, it has to explode at the right instant. So the shells were fitted with mechanical time fuses. Before firing, a gunner would set a ring on the nose to a number of seconds. A clockwork mechanism inside would run down and detonate the shell at that moment. Which means that before every single round, somebody had to correctly predict not only where the aircraft would be, but exactly how long the shell would take to arrive. Get the position right and the timing wrong, and the shell bursts 1,000 feet from a target it was aimed perfectly at. The results were about what you would expect. Depending on the campaign and who is counting, anti-aircraft guns in the early years of the war were consuming somewhere between 2,000 and 20,000 shells for every aircraft they brought down. That is not a weapon. That is a deterrent with an enormous bill attached. What was needed was a shell that knew where it was. The principle had been discussed before the war in Britain, and the British passed the concept to the Americans in 1940 as part of a much larger exchange of secrets. The idea itself is elegant, and it is easier to describe than it sounds. The shell carries a small radio transmitter, broadcasting continuously as it flies. That signal spreads out ahead of it. If it strikes something solid, an aircraft, a wing, an engine, a portion of it bounces back, and the receiver in the shell picks up its own reflection. Because the shell is closing on the target at high speed, the returning signal comes back at a slightly different frequency to the one that was sent. The two signals interfere with each other and produce a low beat note, and that beat note gets stronger and changes as the distance closes. When it crosses a set threshold, the fuse fires. The shell, in effect, shouts, listens for its own echo, and detonates when the echo says it is close enough. That is the entire concept, and every part of the difficulty is in building it. Start with the tube. The vacuum tubes of the period were the size of a thumb, made of thin glass, with electrodes held in place by fine wire supports. Firing one out of a gun should reduce it to powder. The solution came from an unlikely direction. There was already an industry making very small, very rugged vacuum tubes, the hearing aid business. Those tubes were miniaturized, and manufacturers were persuaded to make them tougher still. The internal electrodes were shortened and thickened so they had less leverage to bend. Extra supports were added. The whole assembly was then embedded in wax so that nothing inside could move relative to anything else. Then there was the power supply. A shell might sit in a magazine in the tropics for 2 years before anybody fired it. No battery of the era would survive that. And a battery that was live in storage was a fire in a magazine waiting to happen. The answer to that is one of the most satisfying pieces of engineering of the entire war. They built a battery with no electrolyte in it. Just a stack of dry plates, completely inert, and alongside them a sealed glass ampule containing the acid. When the gun fires, the shock of setback shatters the ampule. The spin of the shell, those 500 revolutions a second, then flings the liquid outward and distributes it evenly through the plate stack. The battery is created by the act of firing the gun. It cannot go flat in storage because it is not a battery in storage. It cannot leak because there is nothing to leak. And it activates in a fraction of a second using the two forces that were supposed to be the problem. The program that built all this was called Section T, run by a physicist named Merle Tuve. The manufacturing eventually spread across more than 100 companies, most of whom were building components without being told what the finished object was for. Which brings us to the name. The device was designated the VT fuse. VT stands for variable time. It is not a time fuse. It has no timing mechanism in it. It does not measure time at all. The name was chosen deliberately so that anyone who came across the term in a document or overheard it in a corridor would assume the Americans had built a slightly improved clockwork fuse and stop being curious. The first confirmed combat kill came on the 5th of January, 1943. The American cruiser Helena in the Pacific engaged a Japanese dive bomber with the new shells and brought it down almost immediately. And then, having proved it worked, the Allies almost entirely refused to use it. The order was straightforward. VT fuses could be fired over water. They could not be fired over land or anywhere over enemy-held territory under any circumstances. The reasoning was cold and correct. Not every shell hits something. A round fired over water and missing simply sinks into several thousand feet of ocean and is gone. A round fired over land and missing lands in a field, and some proportion of them do not go off. A dud proximity fuse, recovered intact, could be taken apart by competent engineers in an afternoon. And Germany had an enormous anti-aircraft problem of its own. Thousands of Allied bombers every night over its cities. Handing the Germans a working proximity fuse would have meant handing them a multiplier on every anti-aircraft gun they owned. So for nearly 2 years, the most effective anti-aircraft device in the world was deliberately withheld from the theater, where aircraft were the biggest threat. Until the summer of 1944, when the threat came over water. In June 1944, Germany began launching the V-1 flying bomb at London, a small pilotless aircraft with a pulse jet, flying at around 400 miles an hour at low altitude in a straight line until its engine cut and it fell. It was, from an anti-aircraft point of view, almost the ideal target. It did not maneuver. It did not take evasive action. It flew a predictable course at a predictable speed, and it came in over the channel, which meant the guns could be moved down to the coast and engage it entirely over water. 3 things arrived at the same time: gun-laying radar that could track a target automatically, an electrical predictor that computed the firing solution continuously rather than by hand, and the proximity fuse. The improvement was not incremental. At the start of the campaign, the guns were bringing down roughly a quarter of the flying bombs that entered their zone. By the end of August, they were destroying something close to 8 and 10. There were individual days near the end when almost nothing got through at all. A weapon that had been arriving over London in the hundreds was being deleted over the sea by guns firing shells that decided for themselves when to explode. The restriction was finally lifted in December 1944 during the German offensive in the Ardennes, and the fuse was released for use against ground troops. Fired over infantry, a proximity-fused shell bursts a set distance above the ground, automatically, every time, spraying fragments downward across a wide area. Digging in stops helping. A foxhole protects you from a shell that lands beside you. It does not protect you from one that detonates above your head. American commanders described the effect on the German offensive in language that is difficult to quote without sounding as though you are exaggerating. Now look back at the objection everybody made at the beginning, because it was completely correct. A vacuum tube is a fragile glass bulb full of thin wires. Firing one out of a gun at 20,000 times gravity and then spinning it at 500 revolutions a second should absolutely destroy it. It should. It does if you use an ordinary tube. The people who said it was impossible were reasoning from the tubes that existed. The people who built it went and made different tubes, and then used the two forces that were supposed to be fatal, the shock and the spin, to switch the battery on. That is the whole trick, and it is a pattern that shows up again and again. The problem was never physics. The problem was that everybody was measuring the idea against the components already sitting on the shelf. There is one last thing, and it is the name again: variable time. A deliberate lie, chosen to be boring, in the hope that nobody would look twice at it. It worked so well that the fuse is still called that. 80 years later, the most significant advance in artillery of the 20th century is still routinely referred to by a code name that was invented specifically to describe something it was not. If you found this one interesting, subscribe for more stories about the weapons everybody underestimated.